Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Horror Corner. I'm your host, Sean Patrick Erschen, and this is Volume 2 of my horror DVD and Blu Ray collection. So, in this one, we're going to talk about some horror flicks that don't really fit into particular subgenres. But let's get started, shall we? So, first up is Misery, directed by Rob Reiner and based on the novel by Stephen King, with excellent performances by James Caan and Kathy Bates in an Oscar-winning role. Amazing movie. Next up, we have the remake of It, which just came out like last year, but I think it's one of the best remakes ever made, in my opinion. Starring Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise the Dancing Clown. I think it's terrifying. Next up, we have another Stephen King classic, and that is Salem's Lot. This one is directed by the great Tobe Hooper of Texas Chainsaw Massacre fame. This one is extremely scary and probably the scariest TV miniseries ever. Next up, we have Stephen King's The Shining. This one is directed by the great Stanley Kubrick. Just a masterpiece of the paranoid-style horror film. I just love the claustrophobic feeling that it creates. And of course, I love the performance of Jack Nicholson as the great Jack Torrance. Next, we have a modern horror masterpiece, and that is Final Destination. Almost like a slasher film, but the slasher killer is death itself, which I thought was a really cool concept. But there's all kinds of brutal kills and elaborate death scenes. Next, we have one of the Japanese horror remakes in The Ring. It's very intense, very scary, starring Naomi Watts. I think this is the best of the Japanese horror remakes. Next, we have the modern monster classic in Godzilla, the recent reboot starring Bryan Cranston. I do enjoy this film, however, I do wish we saw more of Godzilla in it, but it's certainly better than the 90s version. Next, we have The Mistress of the Dark, Elvira's movie McCobb. This one is a collection of giant monster films. So much fun. I love these Elvira collections. Next, we have another modern monster film in Cloverfield. This one is in the style of the found footage film, which I thought was interesting for a monster movie, but it's really well done. Next up, we have the Puppet Master collection. These are so fun. I love these films, and I love how they do the special effects of those little puppets, the killer puppets from hell. And this is 9 movies in this collection. Next up, we have a horror masterpiece from John Carpenter, starring Adrienne Barbeau, the lovely Jamie Lee Curtis, and Janet Leigh in The Fog. One of John Carpenter's best, certainly, outside of Halloween. Next, we have Wrong Turn, one of my favorite horror films of the early 2000s. So much fun. It's definitely my favorite of the Wrong Turn style horror films, the backwards hillbilly type horror flicks. Next, we have Sleepy Hollow, directed by Tim Burton and starring Johnny Depp and Christina Ricci in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow story. I think this is probably the best version of that classic storyline of the Headless Horseman. Next, we have The Great Interview with the Vampire. Man, I love the mood and the style of this film. The cinematography is just off the hook. It's brilliant. And I love the performances of Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt in the legendary vampire roles. Such a great movie. Next we have The Lost Boys, which I'm embarrassed to say I didn't see until this year. Can you believe it, folks? And now I understand what the fuss about it. It's a great movie. Next we have my favorite 80s vampire film, and that is Fright Night, starring a great performance by Chris Sarandon as Jerry Dandridge, and Roddy McDowall and Amanda Beersy. It's just a fun vampire film, and so well made. Next we have my personal favorite werewolf film, and that is The Howling. What a classic. I love this movie. I love the practical effects. I love the story. I love the way it's shot. The mood and the style is so brilliant. It's just off the hook. I can't say much about the sequels, but certainly the original Howling is a classic. Next we have Sinister, another modern horror classic starring Ethan Hawke. This is just a really scary film. Even Roger Ebert said that it's an undeniably scary film, and I have to agree with him. I love the concept of it, and it's very well executed. Next, does this movie need an introduction? Come on, The Silence of the Lambs, starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins, both in Oscar-winning roles, introducing the world to Dr. Hannibal Lecter, Hannibal the Cannibal. Next, we have one of the most original films of the 1980s, and that is Hellraiser. And this one is actually directed by Clive Barker and is, of course, written by Clive Barker based on his novel The Hellbound Heart. Next up, Doug Bradley reprises his role as the horror icon Pinhead in an excellent sequel, Hellbound Hellraiser 2. And this pretty much is where the series ends for me, as I don't really care for any of the subsequent sequels. Next we have Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, starring Gary Oldman in the role of Count Dracula, also Keanu Reeves and Winona Ryder. Next up we have The Grudge, another Japanese horror remake, but this one is definitely the scariest in my opinion. And this one stars Sarah Michelle Gellar. Definitely probably the most jump scares I've ever seen in a movie, but they work. Next up we have the legendary Hills Have Eyes, which is another one I am embarrassed to say I didn't see until a couple years ago. This is an absolute must-have collection on Arrow Video. Brilliant Blu-ray. It's just an awesome movie starring Dee Wallace. It's a masterpiece. Next up we have the British horror classic The Wicker Man, starring the legendary Christopher Lee, Edward Woodward, and Britt Ekland. Of course, Ingrid Pitt as well from the Hammer films. But this is just a great psychological horror film. Just a brilliant movie. I love it. The Wicker Man. Next up, we have the endlessly quotable American Psycho, starring the great Christian Bale in my favorite performance of his. It's just so well made. It's so hilarious, but at the same time, it's very disturbing. It's just a great movie. Next up, we have Saw. It will make your blood run cold. The first of the torture porn films of the early 2000s, which started a whole craze. But it's a great movie, very suspenseful and scary, and very original. And next up is the sequel to Saw, Saw 2, which I think is actually better than the first one. Because Jigsaw had a great adversary in Donnie Wahlberg as Detective Matthews. Plus, you get to see a lot more of Jigsaw, and that's a big plus. Next up, we have another classic torture porn film, and that is Hostel, followed by Hostel 2 in this collection, both directed by Eli Roth. Next up, we have Shaun of the Dead, the classic romantic comedy with zombies. It's so hilarious, so well directed by Edgar Wright, and I love Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. They make a great comedy duo. And it's also a really good zombie film, period. And last we have Cabin Fever, another Eli Roth classic. This one I think is just so funny. It's such a great uh, parody of like slasher type films, and at the same time, it's extremely gory. And I just love the simple concept of it too. Cabin Fever is really enjoyable. Okay, folks, that's it for this round of my horror DVD and Blu Ray collection. Thank you for joining me in the Horror Corner. Tune in and stay scared.